It was chaos. Utter, utter chaos. When he had taken out the leader of the infiltration team, Nasseru had exposed himself as a Sumerian sympathizer and condemned himself to a slow, painful death. But when he had used his powers and called upon Anki to strike down the remaining Anunnaki and save the girl, Nasseru exposed himself as something else entirely. Beat. There was no going back. There never was. With his eyes locked steadily on the gray light, Nasseru ran a hand through his unruly dark hair. It wasn't fair, but in this moment, fairness didn't matter, and all he could do was tilt his head back to accept what was then, what was now, and what had yet to be. And with that acceptance, his mind finally began to settle, and that bolstered Nasseru just enough to face Luma properly. But when he turned, his eyes flicked to the tunnels and back again in alarm. She hadn't moved an inch. She just stood there, her mouth moving with hushed words that he couldn't quite hear, and he didn't need the lights to burn brighter to recognize the unhinged terror in her muted green eyes. Beat. This time the ceiling cracked. Nasseru and Luma could now clearly hear the loud booming sound that echoed up through the floor. It was hard to miss something as deafening as a mountain falling to pieces from inside out. The entire compound rattled like a child's toy, shaking from its deepest foundations to the highest tower climbing several hundred meters above where they now stood. Screams rang into the night, joining the chaos, and with each passing second, more Sumerians dashed through the room that Luma and Nasseru stood immobilized in. Oddly, not one of them seemed to notice either the ascended master or the frightened initiate. It was better that way. With his hands raised in front of him, Nasseru crept closer to Luma, much like he would approach a wild animal. Slowly, he reached for her, but it was no use. For every step forward he took, she took one backwards, her lips still moving with words he couldn't hear. He didn't blame her, really, not after what she had just seen, and what she was undoubtedly thinking about him. Traitor was about the nicest word Nasseru himself could find, and he could bet the rarest gold on his entire existence that whatever Luma thought was worse. Luma. Nasseru needed her to understand what had happened, but there was no time to explain. As much as he'd hoped this path would not be put in front of him, that Luma would flee down the tunnel to safety and he could report to Lumasi that she was safe, and still unable to help, Nasseru also knew that because she had chosen to stay and face him, he had one more thing to do before he could move on and seek out his absolution. "What have you done to our people? You betrayed us." Finally, Luma found her words again, and her entire body shook in anger and a fair amount of terror when she realized that whatever she thought she knew, it was nowhere near all of it. "No." His response was quick and betrayed the hidden pain he carried in his soul. "Everything I have done has been orders. You need to underbeat. Stars. There isn't time. I need you to listen." "What is that?" "The planet is breaking up. Sumer is gone, Luma. Lost. Eridu is elsewhere for you now. Thousands of years of civilization destroyed in a single night by one race obsessively determined on taking what they couldn't have for themselves. And Nasseru now knew that even with this easy victory, Alalu and his people wouldn't stop with the destruction of Sumer. No. They already had their sights set elsewhere. And it was there that the last stand of the Sumerians would take place. But first, they needed time. "You did this! You murdered our people!" There was no polite way to say it. And even if there was, after everything that had happened, Luma wasn't feeling very calm. In fact, she was the direct opposite as she stalked towards him with one palm held firmly against her bleeding neck. The words hit him like a stone anvil. Nasseru clenched his jaw and held his silence, absorbing the truth of her words as the punishment they were intended to be. He reversed his grip on the dagger in his hand and offered it back to Luma. Even if she chose to drive it through his heart and twist the blade until he begged for mercy, the worst she could do was make him bleed. Immortality had its perks. The offered dagger slowed her down. Nasseru saw skepticism register in her eyes as she took it from him, examined it, and sheathed it in her boot, all without letting him out of her sight. He didn't have to read her mind to know that she considered attacking him at least once. Beat. The chamber shook so violently that Luma lost her balance and lurched towards Nasseru, not resisting when he swept in and halted her fall. She looked up at him, her dusty green eyes confused and angry in silent accusation, and in that moment he could have sworn she could see everything he had done. And then, from far off down the tunnels, Nasseru felt the last of the masters leave with those that had made it safely to the extraction zone, and he nodded. So be it. Just the two of them remained, and he could get Luma out on his own. Those were his orders. He had to get her out, no matter the cost. It had been foreseen. Why? This time her voice was softer, and though Luma would never admit it, she was grateful that he'd caught her fall. There isn't time. I need to get you out of here. I'm not going anywhere with you until you tell me, traitor. Against her will, her mind had already decided she was going to let him continue to save her. But Luma pushed herself away from the man who had helped the Anunnaki destroy her people anyway. She tried to stalk away, but the chamber was shaking so violently that she didn't even take 2 steps before his arm was under hers again, holding her upright. Luma, you have no choice anymore. You are needed. I don't care. As stubborn as your brother. Nasseru took hold of her arms and wrenched her back to him, holding her close. He had risked too much for it to all fail now because one stubborn girl refused to take the final steps to answer to her fate. But at least he's where he's supposed to be. Imagine how much you could have helped if you just... Anger stirred deep inside Nasseru, and he shook her by the arm to try and make her see reason. That swept a little of the wind out of Luma's sails, and she twisted in his hold to stare at him, her own anger shining like a beacon in her eyes. Using her brother's name like that, as if he knew him? How dare he? Surely he'd just heard of him that day when he had been with Gula, surely. But right now, in this moment, that day seemed like an eon ago, and it came to Luma's attention that whoever this ascended man was, he still hadn't told her his name. Nobody had ever mentioned his name, or the fact that he had visited her old compound. Odd. You! Nasseru watched her face contort with confusion and fear as she made another futile effort to wrench herself free from his grasp again. He hadn't been wrong when he told Gula she was feisty, but her feisty attitude wasn't what he needed right now. Yes, I know Lumasi. He is Isimud. He paused, but not long enough for Luma to react. We both are. Isimud? Whatever snippy retort Luma had froze forever on her lips as the word sank in. The Isimud were the elite hand of Enki, the supreme ruler of her people. If he could be called that. Some legends stated that Enki was an ascended Sumerian that had refused to leave, instead choosing to remain with his people to ensure they were guided correctly. Another joked that, and he was overly fond of the cheese that could only be made from the goats in the Blue Highlands beyond Ur-Nuru. Luma didn't know which part was true. Her experience with their leader was limited to watching him from afar during ceremony. But she had heard all of the childhood stories about the Isimud and the things they allegedly did to Sumer and her people. Most of those she had dismissed as flights of fancy, tales told to children to enhance their sense of adventure during playtime, and to make them behave. You're... Only now, this man in front of her was... It was true. And her own brother had joined their ranks. Worse, he hadn't told her about it. To Luma, that rated higher on the scale than whatever this man had done. The hand of Enki, yes. Nasaru's iron-tight grip on Luma softened just enough to let her blood flow freely again, and he ran both hands along her arms to ease the shock that had replaced the anger in her eyes. If it were even possible. It wasn't every day she would learn her brother was a spy, from a man she thought was a traitor and would probably hate by the time this mission was done. Everything we do is for our people, including letting Sumer fall to the Anunnaki. Luma whispered again, her mind delving into the memory of a vision she had been blessed with a few rotations past. Image after image flashed through her mind on repeat, but this time one stood out from the rest. And this time, Luma could see his face. She looked up at him, her eyes widening as she realized that maybe he was right. Ina Luiti Sinapana, the man with two faces. Most people just call me Nasaru. His tone was dry, but a hint of humor flashed briefly through the melancholy in his brown eyes. Before she could stop herself, one side of her mouth curled, but Luma quickly shoved any sympathy she felt for him away. Her anger at what he'd done, her confusion about the entire situation, and the guilt that echoed for what he'd said about her were too vast for her to process anything else. I have seen you before. Luma reached up and tapped the side of her head, her wide green eyes even more perplexed. In here. Even before that day with Gula. Only now you have a face. Or two. Why do you think everyone has been telling you it was time? If he wanted to, Nasaru could have seen what Luma was thinking from the moment he had first recognized her in the chamber. He could have seen everything, but it was the most impolite thing an ascended Sumerian could do. Now, however, he reached out to make that connection, curious about what she was seeing, and how it involved him. It had been so long since a proper seer had been born among them that he brushed his manners aside and went searching for what only Luma could see. His hands, still holding her arms, tightened again as he saw himself shifting from Anunnaki to Sumerian and back again, from Sumerian to something else again entirely. He knew his fate, and had since the day he took his first step as an Isimud. But to see it in someone else's mind? The reality of it sped toward him like the comet he had helped Alalu sling toward the unfortunate planet, and Nasaru knew there was no escaping it, and there never had been. Beat. Everything shook constantly. In reality, a few moments had passed, but to the pair standing alone in the chamber with the pedestal and the device that had effectively ended the Sumerian race, time still appeared to creep at a quarter of its speed. The entrance to the tunnels collapsed, huge sections of it falling in a cascading ripple of tile and stone. A dust cloud billowed out of the rubble, whipping around the pair in the chamber unnoticed as their odd conversation continued. Luma would have fallen again if not for the grip on her arms, and she watched in complete fascination as Nasaru's eyes lost focus while he concentrated on something else, his mind clearly going somewhere she could not follow. But as she observed, the light, feathery touch of another consciousness connected with hers, probing into her thoughts, and she swallowed hard as yet another vision rose in her mind. An embrace, much like he held her in now, only much, much more intimate. Stupid, stupid brain. Unbidden, her cheeks flushed with a heat Luma didn't recognize, at least not at first. She swallowed again, wishing for that particular image to be anywhere but in her mind, not while she was connected to a master, and not when it involved his hands decorating her naked body, and his mouth putting that same flush on her cheeks again. The spark Neperdu had alighted could never compete with the furnace Nasaru had created in her stomach. For his part, Nasaru's hadn't fully detached from Luma's mind when he caught what she saw next, and his face paled in shock, eyes widening as he recognized what he had been yearning for all these long centuries. No, please. Not that. He wrenched his mind away and refocused on her again, absolutely crestfallen about what he now had to do. Before he had seen her mind, Nasaru had been hesitant, but now? Now the Ascended One was devastated, and the aching in his chest had nothing to do with the battle they had just fought. It's her. Tilting his head back to stare at the ruined ceiling in dismay, Nasaru swore, closed his eyes, and surrendered his life to the will of the universe, as he always had. The Ascended One needed to move quickly. If he hesitated for even half a second, Nasaru knew that one glance would be enough for him to throw everything to the wind, and if he did that, it would all be over. I'm so sorry, Luma. One day, I hope you'll understand. Faster than her eyes or mind could follow, Nasaru reached inside himself for his doorway to unkey. It funneled into him like a shining celestial conduit that then flooded through to the stunned woman he still held upright. She cried out, stiffening in his grip as it infused her body, and he dropped his head to reveal brilliant amber eyes that glowed with the raw power of the universe. Beat! The chamber shook in its death throes, and without hesitation, Nasaru wrenched more of it into himself and wrapped it around both of them like a protective cloak. He was just in time. Not even a second later, Sumer exploded in a multicolored flash and set off a cascade that would also destroy both of its moons, with a light display so intense that it could still be seen millions of years later.